Team, as we enter into these last weeks, we are going to pivot into the science behind stereotyping. So I'm going to introduce your short final paper in this very, very weird abbreviated semester that kind of just blew up before my face. And ordinarily, if we were in class, we would be reading this spectacular text. As it is now, we're only going to be reading 3 chapters of it, and I'm going to do my best to try to fill in the major ideas so that you guys still have an adequate amount of stuff to work with as you build your papers understanding the underlying science and the impact of stereotyping, which we will get to at the end of this. So the text blind spot is one of my absolute favorites. I've taught it for multiple classes, and it is all about implicit bias. And I love it as an artifact of rhetoric because it's really hard to get people on board with hearing that they're racist, first of all. And also, it's hard to say, like, hey, guess what? There's all of these things that are happening inside of you and in your brain that you have no control over, and they're not really going to stop. And also, that makes you racist. Like, we just can't really get on board with that. It turns people off. And so the way that this text is written is using very, like, as I call it, pat the kitty language of just like, it's okay. This thing is, everybody's like this. You're not just a horrible racist. There's a division between words and actions, which there are. And on Thursday, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, about automatic versus reflective modes in our brain, and how that's such a key difference when it comes to implicit bias. But today, I just want to introduce this, not the idea of implicit bias, but about what's going on in our brain that leads us into that. So we talked about schemas before, those folders that allow us to put all of our information in, and then without any control from us, when we ingest a new piece of information, automatically that schema like runs up all excited and says like, hey, guess what? Also this, and then spits out everything that we know about that thing so far. And sometimes, like with the chair thing, that's helpful. It's like, good, now I can sit on this chair. I don't have to waste mental energy. But obviously it becomes destructive when you're dealing with somebody's individuality. Because if you've collected a lot of common representations of somebody, this is why the idea of representation in something like film is so important, because if you've only seen Indigenous peoples represented in Pocahontas or in made for TV history dramas, like, it's not going to be holistic, and it's not going to show Indigenous peoples as individuals like yourself. It's there to show the cinematic division of somebody who's very, very different and other than you. And so blind spots, how they're defined in the text is are these spaces that are filled with bits of knowledge about different social groups. So similar to, we could all call like schemas kind of like these blind spots. But if you're driving, we have a blind spot in a car, and there's a part in the rearview mirror and in the side mirrors that you just can't see. And so something could be hidden back there. And I think it's a perfect word to use as an analogy for this, because it's something we just can't access, but what's lurking in that blind spot can be really, really dangerous, and it means we just have to do a little bit of extra effort to make sure that we are checking our blind spot. And so I pulled out a couple quotes from here, and I just thought that they worded this well. Hidden biases are capable of guiding our behavior without our being aware of their role. Kind of in a nutshell, that's how they would define the danger of these hidden biases. But they make a really important distinction that everybody has these, but good people are those who intend well and strive to align their behaviors with their intentions. So there's a big difference between what you intend and what just sort of gurgles up in you. So I've mentioned before, I think in class, that I was raised with a really, racist extended family that I don't speak with much. But like, there was stuff that was just instilled in me younger because it was this white Southern family that, although I don't believe it and my parents don't believe it because it's sort of imprinted on me when I was younger, sometimes these automatic thoughts pop up about stereotypes or assumptions that are unchecked. But there's a difference between having something gurgle up and I just think, oh shit, no, that is not what you believe, and then make sure that you don't act on that, and just sort of giving into that. And the really big difference is just intentionality. And so when we talk about blind spots, I talked about it with cars. We have blind spots within our brain anyways, and a lot of these are visual. And so a term that the authors use, Greenspan Greenspan and Banerjee, excuse me. Um, they, I just lost my train of thought, trying to remember their names. Oh, our brain already has some blind spots specifically when it comes to visual things. So we've all seen like those brain teasers, stuff that makes us think like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I see that? So one of my favorites is this one where you're supposed to look at the A box on the checkerboard and then the B, and which one is a lighter color. I think all of us hopefully say B looks lighter. But those two same boxes are down here, just cut and like copied, screenshotted. There's been no altering to this photo. They're the exact same color, but through manipulation, all these different visual manipulations force us, like we're still not able to do that. So now I know that they're the same color, but I still can't see it that way. And that annoys the hell out of me, that I have no control over that. I have no control over how I'm visually perceiving something, even though I know that these are the same boxes. And so that's a good example of mind bugs, these bugs that sort of get in your brain, almost like a bug in a computer or a software system. I'm not going to embarrass myself further by using computer tech, terminology. But it reminds me of the age old, not age old, a couple of years ago. I'm hoping it was more than a couple of years ago. I have no idea when this happened. The blue and black or white and gold. The whole internet just blew up over what are the colors on this dress. Some people saw blue and black. Some people saw white and gold. I see white and gold. I have absolutely no idea where anybody gets blue and black, but people were adamant. And it freaks me out that people can look at the same objective photograph and see different things. So mind bugs work the same way in your brain when it comes mainly to memory. And it can be manipulated really easily. So there's a couple different experiments people have done to test this, and one of them has to do with lists and memory and lists. And so we could have done this in class where we read all of the words on this side, and then we sort of put the paper down and try to remember all of the words that are there. And then we read this next list and we see, okay, which ones didn't show up in here. So all of these are about bugs. So ants, spiders, even small is like, oh yeah, bug, poison, bite, wasp, creepy. We usually think of bugs with creepy, even though bugs are lovely. So if I go over to this list, I see maple, ant, poison, fly, stem, berry. I can already see a bunch that don't. Like I know maple wasn't in that list, even if I'm not looking over here. Or stem, or berry, or birch, or leaves. All of those have to do with trees, not with bugs. And so as I read through, I could pick out, here's the words that belong. Well, guess what? There's another word in here, insect, that 82% of people in a University of Washington study put this on their list. So they misremembered this as being on their list because all of those words that they'd read had to do with insects. And so our memory gets manipulated because our mind is just this automatic association making machine. Our schemas come in, we're reading a list, we're looking for bugs, insect qualifies for us. And so our brain is powerful enough to produce this new information that was not there at all. And so I know that's kind of a confusing one just because of the myriad of words there. But we could call this a false alarm. And our brain, creates false alarms a lot, where we think that we experienced something, thought that we did something, but actually our brain kind of constructed this reality, constructed this seemingly real situation. So an example is my own mother. So I can't remember if I brought this up in class. I've taught this so many times that I always use this example, and all time and space is running together for me. So my mother knew that she'd met Walt Disney. She loves Disney. She had a horrible childhood, and Disney was just sort of like, that was her happy place of Disney movies, Disney anything. And he was definitely a father figure to her. And she knew that she'd met him when she was like 5 or 6 or something like that. And she said, oh, there was a picture taken. It's somewhere in a box in grandma's garage. And this was a tale that was told to me early. It was like the mythos in our family, which I thought was pretty cool, that my mom had like met this absolutely historic man. A couple of years ago, we talked to my grandma, and I was trying to get some old things. And I said, oh, can I get that picture of Mom and Walt Disney? And grandma said, like, that literally never happened. And so my mother had constructed this entire memory based off of what I think was her desire, but she completely thought that it was true. And she was floored and not even embarrassed. She was just gobsmacked, and still feels certain that she met him, even though she now has heard proof from my grandmother of like, nope, I was with you. That would have never happened. So it's also called retroactive interference, where something's going on in your past memories that's interfering with the truthfulness of them. A more current example, a couple of years ago, Brian Williams, who was a very high up NBC host, came or ended up having this whole harrowing story of how when he was in Afghanistan or Iraq, I can't remember exactly what country, but he was like in like the middle of this insane battle, and like he was just a reporter on the field, and then like he had to jump into this helicopter while it was moving and there were explosions and everybody freaked out. They're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing that you had this experience. What a reporter, what a reporter. And then it came out later from the pilot of the helicopter of like that did not happen. That literally never happened. And so this made Brian Williams look horrible. It put his entire journalistic integrity into question, and he ended up getting demoted intensely. But he holds to it. He genuinely thought this thing had happened, and he said in an interview, "Did something happen in my head? Maybe I had a brain tumor. Was there something in my head?" He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that he constructed this because it happened without him realizing. So a better word for this, or a real word for this, is the misinformation effect, which will come up in our research. A couple other examples of this at work. If any of you guys are going into business or psychology, the availability heuristic is going to come up. There's a set of heuristics that are just how we make decisions, and these codes that sort of just show you how people are going to make decisions. If you are going into business, you use a lot of these heuristics to understand what consumers are going to think, how people will invest in something, and so you could have the least risky approach, understanding just how the brain works, so you can kind of bet on people making a choice based on certain things. This is how people understand how to price stuff. But the availability heuristic is all about you sort of grabbing an information that seems to be the most plausible just because it's kind of there, not that it's necessarily true. And this was established by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who are incredible. And their stuff pops up in many, many fields. And so if you are looking for some intellectual stimulation this summer, I recommend reading up on some of their stuff. It's great. And so they conducted a study where they asked people to guess how many more deaths come from these sets. Do more people die of murder, or do more people die of diabetes? Do more people die of murder, or do they die of suicide? Do more people die of car accidents, or do they die of abdominal cancer? The reality is way more people die by diabetes, suicide, and abdominal cancer. Abdominal cancer is one of the major cancers that we just don't really hear about that often. But why would people choose murder and car accidents? Just giving you space to maybe like ponder this in your head. And if we were in class, there would be like no one talking. Because we hear about murder. It's more sensationalized. We hear it on the news. It's much more dramatic. And that sticks in our head more, even though maybe we're like, yeah, diabetes is more logical. It just seems like murder is this threat to us. Same with car accidents. We hear about it all the time. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's true, but we've reached for this thing that's available. We've talked about loaded language before, and that can be used against people, hence the word loaded. And I know that I used this example in class, of how fast was the car going when it was hit, or how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car. And just by changing that word smashed, you can sort of change somebody's memory. So if you're trying to get evidence from a witness or testimony from a witness, this is why lawyers can be so horrible sometimes, is that they can manipulate people's memories by using certain language, which is why rhetoric is so important in any kind of discipline, so that you can be armed against people who are trying to manipulate your brain. And the same thing goes with examples and details, visual details. You can create a scene for somebody, and I believe I use this example as well. If somebody is, I think this case was Sanders was accused of drunk driving, possibly, and if somebody posed it of like, oh, on his way out the door, he staggered against a table, I should say knocking, excuse me, a bowl to the floor, versus on his way out the door, Sanders staggered against the serving table, knocking a bowl of guacamole dip on the white shag carpet. So again, we have the amped up word of staggered, which I guess is used in both. So both of those are pretty persuasive. But even just you're able to visualize, oh, it's a serving table. And there's a lot more drama. It's not just a table. It's a serving table. There's a lot of food on it. Like that's a much more dramatic scene. And you can visualize the scene a little bit more. It's important that you have something that's a dish that's shockingly green on something that's white. It shows that, oh, there was this massive stain there. It was a mess. This wasn't just him like bumping into it and there was just like a little bowl of something. So the power of suggestion is a big deal. But the reality is, like, we can't really help it. We can be armed to avoid that kind of language and to know what's going on. But what we can't avoid is just sort of the snap judgments that go into people's heads. So even as I'm talking right now, without you realizing it, you're probably casting some judgments on just these rando people I found on Google Image about what they do, what kind of job they have. I look at this guy and all my brain says is youth pastor, just because I know but I work at a Christian school, so that he just has like this pastor look to me. And so we're making a lot of assumptions about maybe what these people do, even how friendly they are versus not very friendly, how trustworthy they are versus not very trustworthy, who you would be friends with versus not. And some of those are reasonable, like age. You're probably going to want to be friends with the people who are younger. That's really reasonable. But choosing based on somebody's appearance, who you connect with versus who you don't. And while we are aware that we judge people, we people watch, things like that, when you start making larger decisions that impact their lives, impact your lives, that's when it gets nasty. And I think instantly of job interviews. So when somebody walks into a job interview, obviously the person interviewing them is a person. And so they're going to have those automatic responses, whether they want to or not, even if they're as objective as possible. But there's stuff that they don't even realize, if it's a racial bias, or even there was a study several years ago, I forget when it was, and at Princeton, that proved that when people's eyes are closer together, people view them as less competent. Like, that's something completely out of your control, and it's also out of the control of the interviewer. But that could be one of those little hidden things that might keep somebody from getting a job just based off of the way that their face is. Because I know that both you and I have had the experience of just like seeing somebody and just sort of not liking them. Instantly, without any kind of reason, or being afraid of them, or being irritated at them. And of course, there's a difference between how you actually act. There'd be a difference if you understood that there were certain biases that you held against race, and so that when you were interviewing somebody, if a weird automatic thought came up, you could quiet that, recognize it, say like, okay, we got to quiet that thing down. We know that that's not real. This is a video that I found several years ago that I still love, because it doesn't even have to be a person's facial features. Something like their name or the address on your resume can do it as well. Some people are saying to completely omit addresses because there's biases against where people live as well, certain zip codes, what that means about somebody. Oh, this person's from Irvine versus from Newport. Oh, this person's from Santa Ana versus from Fullerton. And we start to make assumptions. And so that's just one of the many ways, which is sad we have to do it, but many ways that people are trying to mitigate that.
My name's Jose Zamora, and I had to drop a letter to get the title. Every morning I wake up, go on Craigslist, and apply to as many jobs, every job that I feel qualified for. About 50 to 100 a day for months. No phone calls, no emails, nothing. One day I just thought, what if I try Joe? Just remove the S in my name and maybe I can make some dollar signs. The Monday, I decided to go from Jose to Joe. 7 days later, the next Monday, that's when all the responses started coming. That's when all the replies and the emails. The position is open. We want to meet with you. Call us back. I was applying for the same exact jobs, the exact same resume, the exact same experience, just a different name. Sometimes I don't even think people know or conscious or aware that they're judging, even if it's by a name, but I think we all do it all the time.
And do I think that that employer was racist? I don't think so. I don't think they were actively, all these employers all over LA were looking at his resume and saying, "Oh no, it's a Latino dude," and then like putting it away. Nobody wants to be seen as racist. That's why people react so strongly, even people who are outwardly racist, saying that they're not racist, because we know that that is a bad thing. It is, it should be uncomfortable that we are comfortable judging somebody without direct information. That in itself is worth worth considering. But the real problem here is that we just fail to see individuals as individuals. And of course, our brains, I'm sure, have been going to something as publicized as police brutality. One that happened in 2009. That was the year close to the year I graduated college. That like still sticks out in my brain was Omar Edwards, who was a police officer in Brooklyn, and he was killed by his partner because it was raining and he thought he was a suspect. And of course, he's a black man, you can guess. And so that's where this could lead. It's not the only place that could lead. So, but it's where that leads, that something inside of us fails to recognize that criminal and black partner in the force are two different people, or could be two different people. Oh, I dropped my book. I was going to read a quote and I found it. Okay. We do have to keep in mind, I know I've mentioned this before, that we have a very long evolutionary or social past that shapes our nature. We've talked about how our ancestors live in small communities. Nobody really ventures out, and we're just surrounded by physical danger all the time. And so there's a lot of pressure in that kind of environment. And so we needed these mechanisms that made sure that our social choices were focused on survival. And a lot of the mind bugs that we have come from that, of outsiders are bad. People who don't look like me and my family are bad. That's very hardwired in us. And if you are not into the evolutionary thing, it's hardwired in us socially. We exist with learned behaviors that we've learned from our parents or cultures and the generations before us. Whether or not you think that that's there's something genetically passed down like that, it's impossible to denounce just the social weight of that kind of inheritance. However, like, our social world is really, really different from our ancestors. It's basically unrecognizable. And our values have changed, our aspirations have changed. We care about equal rights and fair treatment. We care about individuality and democracy and people's voices being heard. And even though that's only been like for a century or two, a couple centuries, we're still acting in this sort of evolutionary hardwired way, even though the demands that allowed us to survive in the past are not the demands that allow us to thrive now. It's kind of like my thesis of why it is that we should study stuff like this. And so that's what we're doing for our final essay, which is a short one, especially because it has a couple sources in it. So we are going to have a little over 2 weeks to build this guy up, and that's pretty much all we're going to be doing. Our workshops and stuff are going to be pretty muted. Not going to have long lists of things for you guys to complete with other classmates. Our DEJs are going to wind down, but we are going to write this stereotype essay. This prompt is up on this week's module. You could also find it under files. So 5 to 7 pages. Super short. You're conducting your own little low-key internet research on a popular stereotype that's surrounding a marginalized group. So that means we are not going to say why, white people are stereotyped and even use the word reverse racism, because that does not exist, or reverse sexism, etc. However, that doesn't mean that like somebody who's white cannot be stereotyped. I'm white. I'm certainly stereotyped, but not necessarily in negative ways for my race. And so keep yourself from jumping on that that soapbox. So what you'll end up doing is revealing the origin of the stereotype. So an example that I used on the prompt, since we're reading American Born Chinese now, there's a lot of stereotypes that pop up in there. One from our reading today it was a horrible moment of microaggression, not even microaggression actually, but what was it? Wei Chen and Jen and Susie were just sitting and chatting, and then those two asshole dudes came up and were saying racial slurs, like using the term chink, using the term gook, which are not acceptable. And I realized while reading that, I'm like, I don't even know where that word, quote unquote, gook came from. Like, it's not necessarily a stereotype, but when using a slur in this case could count as one. So I could research, like, where did that come from? Why is this thing still like persisting? What has given fuel to this term? Because there's some slurs that have just sort of faded away, ridiculous ones, and some have really endured. I could also just look at the like one of the major stereotypes in there that came up is there was just the grotesque nature of Chinky, and how there's these scenes where he got kind of like rat-like in his appearance, and I'm like, yeah, that's something that comes up historically, and I don't really know where that came from either. Or even just like, eating foods like cat and worms and in a bowl for lunch. It's like that's beyond a stereotype. That's horrible. But it could be something like that. It could be something that's a little more, simple and relevant. One that I'm really interested in is body phobias. So whether it's fat phobia or thin phobias, where people go online and will call out people who are overweight and just say, like, it's just because I care about your health, which is obviously very, very blatant fat phobia, and this person is not somebody that they know. So that's a stereotype too, that all people who are overweight are unhealthy. That's technically not true at all, but it's actually come up a lot with COVID too. A lot of incorrect reports about how obesity is one of the major factors in complicating COVID. So I could look into, like, where did that come from? Being overweight actually used to be a good thing in societies because it showed that you were not working in fields and stuff like that. So that would be really interesting to do a little bit of research. Talking about the general usage, why we think it persists. We could use Blind Spot a little bit for that, talking about schemas, talking about what the authors say about stereotypes. And you'll also make a persuasive case to your reader why the stereotype is a problem. And we'll talk about this next week, but offer some tips to outsmart the machine. So how we can try to undo biases in our brain. So that means if I was doing fat phobia, specifically how people deal with it online, I would maybe highlight a couple really good body positive Instagram accounts, and say follow a lot of those, so you can actually see people being really active. That's not it. The stereotype of just sort of being lazy and unhealthy is not true. So I'm going to have a sample topic. I haven't decided what mine's going to be that I'll follow through with you guys as you're writing these. So you need at least 2 outside sources, and that is not Wikipedia, but there's lots of good sources. They don't have to be scholarly necessarily, but something that's going to provide news articles or provide some historical background maybe about that stereotype. You could also use your sources to bring up a couple examples in the same way that I brought up Officer Edwards. That's like an example of what can happen with a certain stereotype. So you can use sources for that. And then also you're going to bring in some quotes from Blind Spot. Next week, we're going to be reading a couple chapters, and they go by very, very quickly. And then you can also use any of the information that I talked about, or I will talk about this week. Oh, I forgot to link this guy up. Hold up. There we go. So, not just racial, I know racial stereotypes come into people's heads right away, but excuse me, age, gender, sexuality, body type, size, cultural practices, ideologies. It could be some sort of political affiliation or something that people believe in that there's a whole slew of assumptions of like, if you believe this, you must be this type of person. And that's really negative too. General appearance, it's dumb, it's silly, but like blondes is a fun one. Even just like somebody with a beard, like it doesn't have to be something just achingly destructive. This happens for any kind of facial features. Height is another one. Your hometown, economic class, ability or disability, wellness or illness, different careers. We certainly have an idea of what sort of person belongs in what kind of careers, and that can be a problem when it comes to hiring or to being trusted within your field. Religion, religious practices, and so where to start? If you don't know where to start, you can look in areas that you care about. If you are really into film, like maybe look for a character in a film or a TV show recently that you thought just like isn't a good representation of a certain person. Maybe it's a really stereotyped, overweight person, or a Hindu or something like that. It could be, you could look into like controversies that have happened lately. We want to keep stuff to within a year. So if you're really into gaming, look up like, controversies based on gender in gaming and see if there's been stuff that's come up. So you can use kind of those incidents as artifacts that you can study. So an artifact, much like an artifact in a museum, is this example of a larger culture. It's part of a larger culture. So a moment where somebody is bashing someone's weight on Instagram, that moment is an artifact of a much larger problem with a stereotype. And we can use those as good starting points of where to jump off. And my advice for you guys is to be as narrow as possible. The more narrow you go, just the more interesting it is to research it. So, not saying I think probably people who are overweight or unhealthy might actually be too broad for me to do, but I'm not sure. On Thursday, I'm asking you to submit just one sentence telling me what you're thinking about, and that's it. That is a text from my mom. um, and if you are stumped or you have a couple ideas that you think all would be interesting, lay it on me, and I can help choose the one that I think will be the most painless to write in our last couple weeks.